Thank you, Aisha, for this introduction. And I cannot say how delighted I am to have finally the opportunity to speak to Jonathan Littell here. And the reason is that I think not since the publication of The Kindly One, but certainly since I've read it, it has been one of the models for us to think through the problem of forensics. So in a sense, it was the starting point of our encounter, and since then we've been speaking about issues related to other places and the nature of violence in them. But I'd like to start really with what I think and why the Kindly One has been important for us. And one has to, I think, start that discussion with a similar starting point that our work perhaps get it from different direction. And that is a certain unease with the historiography of both contemporary and historical violence of the 20th century. And working in the human rights sector, and you've been working in for humanitarian organizations, we've realized how much of the historiography of violence, of the way in which we understand, discuss violence, narrate it to ourselves, has been discussed and somehow narrated to us from the point of view of the survivor as the witness. And that frame has been incredibly important for the development of contemporary human rights movements since the 70s, of the human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, for which the survivor as the witness was not only an epistemological problem, i.e. what the witness has seen, how we can actually learn about the situation, but an ethical and political gesture. However, we were wondering, with still kind of insisting on the importance of that point of view, whether the emphasis on the survivor's perspective has not hidden away or masked another aspect, a very important aspect of violence. And when I've read your book, it became very clear to me that the figure of Max Auer, and you will talk about him in a second, somehow, of course, belonging to the group of perpetrators, but somehow a kind of a surveyor of war. Max Auer is joining and kind of present in all the major atrocities of the Second World War as an officer in the SS or SD, writing reports back to Berlin about it, somehow a kind of a perpetrator witness to those atrocities. And it occurred to me that this character, Max Auer, ability to survey the entire battlefield from the front to the rear, to the home areas, to being present to discussions, is a kind of perspective that is afforded really to the perpetrator. And that seemed to be a kind of a departure from what was referred to as the era of the witness, something that also one of your teachers at Yale, Shoshana Feldman, has described. So I just wanted to ask for you to speak a little bit about Max Auer and the kind of perspective on violence that was enabled through the telling of the story from his point of view.
Thanks, Eyal. I'm not sure I have much to say about Max. I mean, he's very talkative himself, and so he can manage his own talking. But to respond to what you're saying in terms of the more fundamentals, I think first of all, I really like this notion of the perpetrator witness that you're evoking, which may have been conceptualized recently, but actually is quite an old concept. I mean, there's nothing new about that. After World War II, when the trials were organized, the main Nuremberg trials and then the subsidiary trials, quite a few perpetrators were called as witnesses in this court of law. And they were offered deals, they were given some form of, not forgiveness, but let's say forgetfulness about their own sins in exchange for testimony against people that the courts considered to be more important. And in some cases, as in the case of an SS general called von den Bach-Zelewski, the perpetrator witness could be an incredibly high-level criminal. I mean, von den Bach-Zelewski is personally responsible for the destruction of hundreds of thousands of Belarusians. He's responsible for the destruction of Warsaw in August of '44. He was responsible for the destruction of Budapest. So we're talking about a major war criminal. And he got a free pass because he could testify against Goering and a couple of other senior people, and he could give testimony about the intentionality of the orders he had received that he was executing, being at the next level down. So, this notion of perpetrator witness has already been quite integrated into the judiciary system already, even at that stage. I'm not even talking about earlier occurrences, but at that stage. And then in the historiography, properly speaking, it's true that the focus in the 70s and the 80s, well, there were all kinds of different focuses, but survivor was obviously a very major focus. But starting in the 90s, early 90s, so 10 years before I started my project, already the historiography was concentrating on the perpetrators, really moving out of what in Germany was called a Historikerstreit, this conflict about who was worse, the Nazis or the Soviets, and then we moved on to something else. And people, thinking especially of Christopher Browning, and also, of course, Goldhagen, whom I don't like his work, but he was very important in bringing the focus onto the perpetrator. And that's been the major field of study for the past 20 years in the historical research on World War II. And therefore also, not in human rights daily practice, when human rights organizations that I've never worked for one, but I've had a lot of interaction with them over the years. Obviously, when they're documenting crimes, they do tend to focus on the witness perspective. But when they take a step back, thinking, for instance, of Human Rights Watch's immense 900-page report on Rwanda, which is a major document on Rwanda, they also focus, once they can take the time and the distance, on perpetrators and perpetrator testimony, if and when it's available. The thing about perpetrators is usually, especially when they've lost, is that it's a lot harder to make them talk than it is to make survivors talk. I mean, survivors have difficulty talking from psychological trauma, but perpetrators have difficulty talking because they're risking, their necks or long prison sentences, and so they don't want to talk for this reason. An interesting case recently, because this is really an ongoing thing in many, many levels of the public debate. There's the historiography, there's the human rights approach. We've also seen a shift in movie making, which I'm very interested in now. You take a film like Shoah, which already brings in perpetrators and survivors and witnesses, the Poles. But what Hilbert called the bystanders. But Landsman's bias is very pro-survivor. He does not grant the same status to the speech of the perpetrators as he grants to the speech of the survivors. So he's only interested, when he interviews perpetrators, he's not interested in their experience, their lived experience. He's interested in facts. And so the way he approaches them in the interviews is very different from the way he approaches the survivors of the Shoah. But following Landsman, in the cinematography, you have a filmmaker like Ritipan, the Cambodian, who's made now several major documentary films about the Cambodian genocide. And already you have a very different approach. He's confronting perpetrators and survivors in S21, and it's a very productive mechanism. Having them dialogue together today about what happened then. He focuses in Dush on a perpetrator. The most recent film in this line is Joshua Oppenheimer, our common friend's film, The Act of Killing, in which Josh it's an extraordinary film because it's the first time I've ever seen, well, first of all, I've never seen perpetrators talk so much and so willingly and so openly about their crimes in an extremely kind of pleasant manner. I mean, there's a character in the film, after recreating the way he would strangle people with wire, turns towards the camera with a big smile and says, of course I would never would have worn a white suit at the time. I mean, that would have been, you know, whatever, messy. So, but what's so interesting about Joshua Oppenheimer's film, which some of you may not have seen, is about the Indonesian genocide in 1964-65 against the communists, is he's interviewing people who won. It's a very rare case in which the perpetrators of genocide came out on top at the end and are still today in power in Indonesia. And therefore, their perspective on speaking is very, very different. It's much freer in a way because they're in power. And they, not only are they in power, but they glorify every year ritually in very large public ceremonies the genocide that they committed. It is, if you could imagine as a thought exercise, Nazi Germany winning World War II, and then we teleport to the 1980s, in which, okay, the more modern economists of the Nazi regime are now the people actually running the country and trying to integrate into the world order and moving on with things. But they still have to deal with all these dinosaurs that committed all these horrors back in the 40s, so we have to keep them happy. So we throw beer parties every year and we do a big ceremony with all the flags and we say, yeah, you guys were heroes. This is, you know, it's fantastic what you did. And then we go back to business and they stay off in the corner. That's what's happening in Indonesia today. And the film shows this in an extremely graphic, you know, interesting manner. So, you know, I came at this from somewhere else again, which is literature, and I think literature is something extremely specific. I mean, beyond the intellectual content of what interested me, literature is literature, and you know, it performs a different role, it functions differently. You can do things with literature you're not allowed to do in other regimes of discourse, but it's more than a regime of discourse. It's also a very, you know, something very, I don't know, you just enter into what you're doing in a different way than if you're doing something analytical, which is why I don't like to talk about it much. I think literature is something you do, but you don't really talk about.
Well, but I think that one of the characteristics of the kindly one, at least is in the way that I've read it, is that it kind of moves from like hyper-realism, extremely detailed description of systems, of debates, of forms of calculation, calculations of life and death, calculation of calories, of work power, of labor, of the kind of the war economy, really intensely, ferociously kind of forensic description of spaces, of bridges and their construction, on the way that you dynamite them. I mean, there's an incredible level, there's incredible texture to the book in the kind of the resolution with which you, Max Auer, is kind of dealing with the world as he surveys the battlefield. No, it is his perspective affords him a kind of a. It almost seems to me when I was reading it that a lot of in the description of the material world, in the way in which there's a scene where Max Auer is meeting a bridge engineer. And the bridge engineer is describing to him throughout many words in the book the tensile and the you know, kind of the structural way in which a bridge is put together and its function and where exactly you put the dynamite, etc. And it seems that a lot of the kind of the logic, also the logic of the mind, is externalized into the materiality of the battlefield, the materiality of the technique, of the machinery also, of war, the machinery of destruction, etc. In other sense, in other moments, that kind of intense description, we're not even touching the surface of things, we are boring into the depth of their materiality. It kind of moves and completely dematerializes into fiction, into surreal fiction. And those transitions I found incredibly moving. And I know they've been also very controversial, because the minute that you start describing something in such a kind of, you know, sort of forensic detail, the expectation from you is to engage the material as almost as a historian. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about that relation between the research, the actual description of historical fact and spaces, how you have conducted your research for this book, and how surreal fiction is actually kind of coming out or somehow emerging from this dead matter.
Well, the research is nothing to say. I mean, you guys do research all the time. I just read a lot of books and took a lot of notes and organized material. This is not terribly interesting. But in relation more to what you're saying, all these different aspects, I mean, what I'm interested in is reality, the way reality is lived, at least by me, because that's what I know. And I've spent a lot of time in wars, and this is how I live reality in wars. You have moments. For instance, the bridge episode, which you quote, is actually kind of a true story. I worked in Mostar during the Bosnian War for 8 months, and there were 11 bridges, of which 10 had been blown up, including the old bridge. And there was only one bridge that had been left standing. And I met this French bridge engineer who had come in, who ended up rebuilding the old bridge years later, but he actually at the time had come to rebuild the Tsarina Most, which was an old Austrian bridge, in the 19th century Austrian bridge, important for traffic. And we hit it off, we had a lot of drinks together, and one day he took me on a tour of the valley, and he took me to all the blown up bridges, and he explained to me why they had fallen the way they'd fallen. This one they did a really good job, look, he went that way. That one they did a lousy job, it's half in the water, and he was just showing me all these things, and I just remembered that, so I put it in the book. But dreams in daily life, but even more so in war, are also part of your experience. This is experience. I mean, when you dream, the texture of food you eat, in a quiet moment, I mean, everything is part of, and so for me, it was just trying to put all these things, both the systems, which I'm interested in, but like even Max's meetings, like you were talking about the food calorie stuff, this was a direct projection from my work in humanitarian aid. And the meetings with Max, arguing with colleagues about food rations for prisoners, I took this directly from UN meetings. I was having meetings with UN guys all the time, and then you have these ridiculous, surreal meetings with lots of very intelligent people who really know what they're doing, but you also have a lot of idiots in these kind of contexts and just making problems and obstructions for whatever reason. And I just, modelized that back into Nazis. I actually used a program that we had in my aid agency for calculating calories for people we were feeding. And I entered what I found in the literature, the Auschwitz rations for prisoner, into this program to calculate the proteins, the lipids, the glucids, the calories, So it was very directly linked to some of my working experiences. But I was interested in getting that texture because that's what life is like when you're actually living it. I mean, a day has 24 hours, sleep is part of your life, and all these things are the texture of your life. And as a writer, that's what I'm interested in.
I think that it's funny that you speak about it kind of a 24-hour experience in the process of reading. I think that, a big book, it's not just longer than a short book, right? There's another experience in kind of entering into a kind of a time space of reading. And that was my experience of reading your book. And of course, for me, the process of reading was incredibly, I was reading it almost in one go, but the one go was like 3 days, which I almost kind of like had to cut out of my life otherwise. But it becomes a kind of a 24-hour process of reading because you read your book, you sleep with it, you wake into reading it again. So that sort of move from the kind of surreal, very erotic sense of kind of the fantasy and the materiality of horror, the molecular level of violence that exists there is absolutely kind of one of the most powerful experience in reading that book. And I wanted to connect it really to to the kind of the humanitarian experience that you had, because I think, speaking to you, I mean, there's almost kind of like three type of engagement, types of engagement with violence for you in recent years as a humanitarian, working in Chechnya and in other places. Working on hunger, right? So directly on the body, on calories, on that kind of nutritional dimension in war. Working as a journalist and working as a novelist. You know? And I think that create a kind of a very intense slippages somehow between those forms of engagement. And I think that both in A Kindly One and also in your later work on Chechnya and Syria, that kind of it manifests itself. In relation to the sort of calculations of life and death that are involved in a humanitarian action, you've spoken about in other places, and we know from a common friend, Ronnie Brauman, who is the former president of Doctors Without Borders, and also together with Eyal Weizman, the director of this magnificent documentary on Eichmann, the specialist. He has been really kind of promoting a rather kind of controversial discourse on the moment when the humanitarian work and the works of several actors within sort of the Holocaust has been overlapping, and positioning the humanitarian somewhere between the perpetrator and the victim. And I'd like to ask a little bit more about how your experience and your actual work, what you've done as a humanitarian in Chechnya, for example, has structured the way in which you experience violence and later narrate it.
The problem you evoke about humanitarian aid is really complex, and we'd need several hours to treat it fairly. I mean, time we don't
take 2
have.
minutes.
I'll take 2 minutes. Just to give a few parameters, let's put it this way. One is that the field has changed. It has evolved a lot. I worked in the 90s, and humanitarian aid in the 90s was a very different thing than in the 2000s. It was a real paradigm shift, which began with Kosovo in 98, but really materialized very strongly with the American wars, the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, in which the Americans moved to take control of humanitarian aid and make it a tool of their policy, both directly in Afghanistan with the reconstruction teams, the PRRs, and indirectly by influencing budgets, ideology, to make the humanitarian aid part of the occupation strategy. But these problems were already asked back in the 90s, although they weren't so acute, let's say, or at least we didn't perceive them as so acute. I mean, you talk about Ronnie, and he was young at the time. It's more Marijo and the older guys who broke away from the ICRC with this idea that, precisely we have to intervene, we have to break dynamics, we have to independently act to cut in and change things.
Well, they broke from the ICRC because the ICRC promoted a kind of politics of neutrality, of
ICRC
not taking sides, and not bearing witness.
Yeah, well, ICRC is a treaty organization. I mean, it's part of the international mechanism that regulates the world order, like the UN, like many other bodies. The ICRC is the emanation of the Geneva Conventions. It's a treaty organization that has a very high status, and they play by very strict rules, which are the rules of the treaties that they are the implementer of. And Marijo and Kushner at the time and some of the other guys felt this was not enough, that something else had to be done. But there was also from the very start this kind of naive idea that we would, that not only we would be neutral, but that the intervention would be neutral. And this is an idea that completely broke down in Ethiopia in 83, 84, the big Ethiopia famine, which is, I think, Ronnie's founding traumatism. I mean, Ethiopia really traumatized them. Because suddenly they realized that the aid was being instrumentalized by Mengistu for his genocidal purposes, or quasi, it's never been qualified as a genocide, but in any case, the mass forced displacements of populations were being aided and abetted by the aid being brought in. And this is a pattern that has been completely recurrent in so many conflicts. So in the 90s, people started thinking about it conceptually, and there was this concept that was floated in the 90s, was called do no harm, in which you would try to calibrate your intervention in such a way that the way you delivered aid would not do more damage than it would help. But even that was not very effective. And I think now there's some very specific situation in which aid is still legitimate and adds a plus. But in most cases, it's just a tool of political forces that are far beyond the control of the agencies in question. There's also distinctions you have to make between food and medical aid. MSF, Doctors Without Borders, is a medical organization. And when you treat a wounded person, by legal definition, a wounded person is a non-combatant, whether he was former combatant or not. Therefore, your aid is objectively neutral. Even if the other party is accusing you of helping enemy combatants, legally, you're treating a wounded person. Food is very different. Food is a weapon of war. Food feeds soldiers. When I brought food to the mountains in Chechnya, I'm very careful about my distribution lists. I am studying my target population very closely, and I'm delivering food to, say, single mothers with more than 3 children or whatever the hell the criterias were. But a lot of these single women with 3 children, well, their husbands were combatants, their sons were combatants against the Russians, Chechen rebels, and they're not going to withhold this food from their husbands or sons or brothers. So the food I'm giving, and then the Russians come to me and they say, you're helping the fighters. And it's very difficult for me to say, no, I'm not helping the fighters. At the same time, the Russian army, I'm taking now the specific case of the ambiguities, I'm using Chechnya as a case. So on the one hand, the Russians are saying I'm helping the combatants. On the other hand, the Russians have invaded what is part of their country. It's an internal conflict. Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation. They've savagely destroyed it. They've killed tens of thousands of people. They've displaced hundreds of thousands of people. But they have a legal occupation, because it's their population, it's their citizens, to take care of all these people. They have to care for their own population as a government. And they delegated this care to us. So us, by being there, by feeding these people, we are relieving the Russian government of its responsibility as an occupying power in its own country. Okay, so, we're actually actors on both sides of the conflict in this case. And we're being instrumentalized very strongly by the Russians. Even if we're aware of it, it doesn't matter. We're still doing it. We try to do it better than they would do it. We try to do it more fairly. We try to make sure that more people are getting food. But still, we're in essence doing what the Russian government should be doing, which is feeding and housing and building latrines for people they have victimized. And we become an agency completely of the conflict.
I think that humanitarian.
Can I just finish one detail?
Yeah, of course.
Just to finish on this, I think it's a very acute perception now of actors in conflicts, especially in all the conflicts involving Islamic actors, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Their perception that we are part of the enemy, which we've been trying to fight through our discourse about neutrality, has completely broken down, which is why now you're getting so many more aid workers killed, kidnapped, because we are clearly identified as being a part of what these people are fighting.
Yeah, and therefore there are organizations that are claiming if you cannot be, if anyway, a priori, your intervention into a war or conflict with aids, with medical aid, or with nutrition, the kind of intervention has to come from solidarity. So if you anyway will be political, or your intervention would be an intervention, let's intervene within that. And then you have organizations such as the IHH in their flotilla to Gaza with a clear kind of merging of humanitarian or provisions with a political manifestation that was, in fact, in that case, as people could see in the exhibition below, has been quite effective in at least alleviating a great part of the siege on Gaza. I see that we are running out of time. I mean, it's been such a pleasant conversation.
You want to show the Chechnya photos?
It's exactly what I wanted to suggest. That I will screen some of your the photographs that you've taken while working.
This is how we finally get to forensics, because we haven't even mentioned forensics yet.
Forget about forensics. Just tell us what we see in those images.
Briefly. So this, it's not in the show downstairs, but it's in the book that was published with the show. And these are actually my amateur photography, which I had mostly done to show my bosses back in France what the place looked like. That was the original motivation for taking most of the photos. And then a couple of years later, I organized some photos into an album for my own personal use, and Eyal kind of liked the amateur family album side of things. So he asked me if he could use this for this project. And there's a documentary quality. I mean, you see to some of these photos. I mean, I'm not like the people who were talking before us. I mean, it's not for a court of law. It's not for any process. There's one little thing I did for Human Rights Watch, which was pretty specific. But it's to show my bosses, you know, the level of destruction. We were having very big arguments with the United Nations at that stage when these photos were taken, April, May of 2000, about population levels in Grozny, this was a very political issue. The Russians were dramatically inflating the figures of population in Grozny. The UN, which is usually in many cases tends to follow the line of the host government, was sort of politely being willing to accept these figures, which are about 10 times the actual real number of people residing in the city at that stage. This is 2 months after the end of active fighting. Grozny was a city of 400,000 people before the war, before the first war, probably back to close to that level between the two wars. And we spent days and days driving around the city, and I was photographing neighborhoods, but also looking at them and trying to estimate just roughly how many people could possibly be living in this city. And we were figuring no more than 20,000, whereas the Russians were saying 150,000, which obviously was affecting food delivery quotas. You know, there'd be a lot more aid delivered. But also propaganda value for the Russians. Look, it's already going back to normal life. I mean, this is what they're calling normal life at the time. Obviously, things have changed a lot since, and we were going to talk about the book I wrote in 2009, which is more of a journalistic work on Chechnya.
Yeah, talk about it briefly.
Well, it's not much. I mean, I went back in 2009, and I don't know if you brought Thomas's photos in.
Yes.
But just to show you, because the city has been, see this, for example, this building here, you see that's what happens when a plane flies over a building and drops 500 kilo bombs every couple of stairwells. They just go boom, 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 and you know, that's what's left of a long building. And so when I went back in 2009, kind of had a shock. I hadn't been back since 2001, and now you can show them what the shock looked like, if you have it here. Can you skip forward? Yeah, this is 2009. Keep moving. That's a propaganda poster, but that's what the city looks like today. It's unbelievable the amount of money Russia's pumped into erasing every trace of this war. They've just erased it.
You actually told me that it's built into the urban regulations, into the building regulations, that you're not allowed to leave any trace of war.
No, not exactly in the building regulations. When I was there, it was mostly public buildings, but there's still a part of town called the Chechnya sector, which is where the private houses are, and they still had traces. And Ramzan was putting a huge amount of pressure on private inhabitants. Ramzan Kadyrov, the dictator of Chechnya, was putting pressure on private residents to erase all traces of damage on their houses under threat of having the houses torn down if said damage was not erased. But you know, you get to a stage, this is 2009, it's 6 years after the end of fighting. There's probably less traces of the war than there is here in Berlin today of, you know, 1945. I mean, go back that photo. That's Vedeno in the mountains. That's a small village in the mountains, which was just leveled completely. This was Basayev's hometown. And that's a shopping center now in the middle of Vedeno, right next to the Russian military base. So this kind of perpetration, it's not even, you can't even call it a Potemkin village because the buildings are actually functional. I mean, they're real shopping malls. You can buy stuff in them. The houses are not the most comfortable, but they're livable, you know. So it's creating a completely artificial normality when in fact political repression is going on, forced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, torture, murder on a daily basis.
It reminds me of a conversation that I had with Bernd Sharon this morning when we were discussing construction as a form of erasure. And I think that kind of reconstruction has
in
been
this case,
part
completely.
Of a historical erasure. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
And these Olympic Games that we have just witnessed are sort of the final end of that arc in which Putin with these Olympic Games is saying, see, the whole Caucasus is under control, there's no problem. They've actually erased another city to make the Olympic Games, but it's part of that same logic of like restoring an enforced normality through architecture.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you for inviting me.